A day like any other. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Oakwood Elementary, casting long shadows on the hallway floor. The school buzzed with the usual morning chatter of excited children, backpacks swinging as they raced to their classrooms. For most, it was just another school day filled with lessons and recess. But for Caleb Johnson, an 8-year-old boy with bright brown eyes and a heart full of hope, it was a day that would change everything. Caleb had always been a curious and energetic boy. He loved learning, even though school wasn't always easy for him. He wasn't the fastest at math or the best at spelling, but what he lacked in academic brilliance, he more than made up for with hard work and determination. His mother often told him, "It's not about being the smartest, Caleb. It's about giving it your all, no matter what." And give it his all, he did. Every night, Caleb would sit at the kitchen table with his books spread out, working tirelessly on his homework. His father, Malcolm Johnson, a well-respected lawyer known for defending civil rights cases, would sometimes sit next to him, helping with the tougher questions. But Malcolm never gave Caleb the answers. Instead, he guided him, teaching him to think for himself. Caleb's mother, Lorraine, a teacher at a nearby high school, always reminded him to stay focused on his dreams. She'd seen too many children give up because of the unfairness of the world, and she wasn't going to let that happen to her son. This morning, Caleb felt especially proud of the homework he had completed the night before. It wasn't just a regular assignment. It was a project Miss Blake, his third-grade teacher, had given to the class a week ago. Caleb had spent hours working on it, carefully writing out every answer, double-checking his math, and even adding illustrations to make it more creative. He couldn't wait to hand it in. As Caleb entered the classroom, his smile widened as he saw his friends. He waved to them, his missing front tooth giving his grin a gap-toothed charm. But as his gaze fell on Miss Blake, his smile faltered. Miss Blake wasn't like the other teachers Caleb had known. She was strict, almost too strict, and had a way of making Caleb feel invisible. No matter how hard he tried, it seemed like he could never get her approval. Her cold demeanor and curt remarks always left him feeling like he wasn't good enough. But Caleb had learned to push past it, reminding himself that not everyone would like him, and that was okay. "Good morning, Miss Blake," Caleb greeted her, his voice full of the usual cheer. Miss Blake glanced at him over the rim of her glasses, her lips barely moving as she replied, "Take your seat, Caleb." Caleb's shoulders slumped slightly, but he quickly bounced back, walking to his desk near the middle of the room. As he settled in, he carefully pulled out his homework, placing it on the corner of his desk, exactly as Miss Blake had instructed the class to do. The day proceeded like any other. Miss Blake went over the math lesson, and Caleb raised his hand eagerly, even though she rarely called on him. When the bell for recess rang, Caleb grabbed his backpack and raced outside with his friends. The playground was his sanctuary, a place where he could forget about the strange coldness from his teacher and just be a kid. But when the bell rang for the end of recess, something changed. As Caleb returned to the classroom and sat down, he noticed Miss Blake standing at the front of the room, her face expressionless, as she held up the homework assignments. Caleb could feel the anticipation building in the pit of his stomach. He had worked so hard on his project, and he hoped, just this once, that she would notice his effort. Miss Blake began handing back the papers, one by one. When she finally reached Caleb's desk, she paused. Caleb looked up at her, his heart pounding. Without a word, she placed his paper face down on his desk and moved on. Caleb frowned, his excitement fading as he flipped the paper over. There, scrawled in red ink across the top of his assignment, was a single word that made his heart drop. Lazy. Caleb stared at the word, blinking rapidly as if he could will it away. He felt a lump form in his throat. He had worked so hard, stayed up late to finish the project, and this was what he got. The word seemed to mock him, taunting him with its harshness. But as he read further down the page, his stomach twisted in knots. There was another note at the bottom. written in smaller but equally cruel handwriting. "You people are never going to amount to much." Caleb's hands trembled as he read the words. You people. What did that even mean? Did she mean kids like him? Or was it something worse? He glanced around the room, but no one else seemed to notice the horror unfolding on his desk. His classmates were busy chatting, comparing grades, or flipping through their own papers. For the first time in his young life, Caleb felt utterly alone. He wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the cruel words written by someone he was supposed to trust. Miss Blake had always been strict, but this felt different. It felt personal. He quickly stuffed the paper into his backpack, not wanting anyone to see. He couldn't let his friends know. They wouldn't understand. And he definitely didn't want his parents to find out. His dad always told him to be strong, to rise above ignorance. But this wasn't just ignorance. This was something deeper, something uglier. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Caleb couldn't focus on the lessons or the chatter of his classmates. The word lazy echoed in his mind, followed by the even more painful remark, "You people are never going to amount to much." As the final bell rang, Caleb packed his things in silence. Usually, he would be excited to go home, where his mother's warm embrace and his father's encouraging words waited. But today, he felt like an imposter. He wasn't sure how to tell them what had happened, or if he even should. As he walked out of the school, the weight of the words on his homework followed him like a dark cloud, overshadowing the bright afternoon sun. But little did Caleb know, the storm that had been brewing was about to be met by a force far stronger than he could ever imagine, his father. And once Malcolm Johnson discovered the cruel injustice that had been done to his son, there would be no going back. The weight of silence. Caleb trudged along the familiar path toward home, his once lively steps now heavy with an unspoken burden. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, barking dogs, children's laughter, the rumble of distant traffic, felt muffled, as though the world itself had dimmed in response to the ugly words scribbled across his homework. He clutched his backpack tightly, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The Johnson family lived in a modest but warm home on a quiet suburban street. The house, with its white picket fence and carefully tended garden, was a symbol of the hard work and love that Caleb's parents had poured into building a life for their family. His father's prized vintage car gleamed in the driveway, while the smell of his mother's cooking wafted from the open kitchen window. It was a comforting scene, but today it offered Caleb little solace. As he approached the front door, Caleb paused. He could hear his mother humming a soft tune from the kitchen, the sound usually a source of comfort. But now, the thought of stepping inside, of facing his parents with the truth of what had happened, filled him with dread. His mother, Lorraine Johnson, greeted him with her usual warm smile as he entered. "Hey, baby. How was school?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she bent down to kiss his forehead. "Fine," Caleb mumbled, avoiding her gaze. He quickly moved past her and headed for the stairs. Lorraine's brow furrowed as she watched her son's unusually subdued behavior. "You okay, Caleb? Did something happen?" "No, everything's fine, Mom. I'm just tired," Caleb replied, forcing a weak smile before bolting up the stairs to his room. As soon as the door closed behind him, Caleb dropped his backpack on the floor and sank onto his bed. His heart was still racing, the sting of the teacher's words echoing in his mind. He wanted to scream, cry, or even tear the paper to shreds, but all he could do was stare at the ceiling, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten with each passing minute. Should he tell his parents? They had always told him to speak up when something was wrong. But this felt different. He didn't want to cause trouble, and he certainly didn't want to disappoint his father. Caleb idolized his dad. Malcolm Johnson was a towering figure in his life, both literally and figuratively. As a prominent civil rights lawyer, Malcolm had built a reputation for standing up to injustice, fighting tirelessly for those who couldn't defend themselves. Caleb often heard stories about his father's cases, how he'd helped families who had been wronged, how he stood tall in courtrooms, unafraid to speak truth to power. His father had told him many times, "Caleb, in this world, there will be people who judge you because of the color of your skin. But don't you ever let them define who you are. You are powerful, you are brilliant, and you can achieve anything you set your mind to." But how could Caleb face him now, knowing that his own teacher had written such cruel words? What would his father say? Would he think Caleb was weak for not standing up for himself? Torn between shame and fear, Caleb decided to keep the incident to himself, at least for now. Downstairs, Lorraine finished preparing dinner, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her mother's intuition told her that Caleb wasn't just tired, as he claimed. His quiet demeanor, the way he'd avoided eye contact, it wasn't like him. She glanced at the clock, wondering when Malcolm would be home. He'd know how to talk to Caleb. Just as she was setting the table, the front door creaked open, and Malcolm walked in, his presence filling the room with his usual calm authority. At over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a deep, commanding voice, Malcolm was a man who rarely went unnoticed. His salt and pepper hair, always neatly trimmed, and his sharp suits gave him the air of someone who had long since earned respect, both in and out of the courtroom. "Smells good in here," Malcolm said, leaning down to kiss Lorraine on the cheek. "How was your day?" "Busy as usual," Lorraine replied, though her mind was still on Caleb. "How about yours?" "Had a meeting with a new client. Another discrimination case," Malcolm said, his voice serious. "Seems like these cases just keep piling up." Lorraine nodded, knowing how much her husband's work weighed on him. He fought for justice every day, but it was a never-ending battle. "Speaking of discrimination," she began carefully, "I think something's bothering Caleb. He came home today and barely said a word. I asked him if something happened at school, but he just said he was tired." Malcolm frowned. Caleb was usually full of energy after school, eager to share stories about his day. "I'll go check on him," he said, heading for the stairs. Caleb had pulled out his action figures, hoping they would distract him from the sinking feeling in his chest. But even his favorite superheroes couldn't shake the heavy cloud of sadness hanging over him. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear his father's footsteps approaching until Malcolm gently knocked on the door. "Hey, buddy. Can I come in?" Caleb quickly wiped his eyes and sat up straighter. "Yeah, sure, Dad." Malcolm stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. He looked at his son with concern, noting the way Caleb was fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, a telltale sign that something was wrong. "How was school today?" Malcolm asked, his voice soft but probing. "It was fine," Caleb replied, his eyes avoiding his father's. "Your mom says you've been quiet since you got home. You want to talk about what's going on." For a moment, Caleb considered telling him everything. He imagined how his father would react, how his eyes would darken with anger, how his voice would harden as he demanded justice for his son. But that image terrified Caleb. He didn't want to be the cause of more trouble, especially for his dad, who already had so much on his plate. "I'm just tired," Caleb mumbled, staring at the floor. Malcolm studied his son for a long moment. He could sense that there was more to the story, but he also knew Caleb wasn't ready to open up just yet. Pressing him wouldn't help. So instead, he placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder and said, "You know, Caleb, you can always come to me. No matter what it is, okay? There's nothing we can't handle together." Caleb nodded, his throat tight with unspoken words. Later that evening, as the Johnson family sat down to dinner, Caleb kept to himself, picking at his food while his parents talked about their day. Lorraine occasionally glanced at him, her concern growing, but she knew better than to push him when he wasn't ready to talk. Malcolm, too, remained quiet, though his mind was already working. He knew something had happened at school, something serious enough to upset his normally cheerful son. The night passed uneventfully, but as Caleb lay in bed, Staring up at the ceiling, he knew he wouldn't be able to keep his secret for long. The words on his homework were still burned into his memory. Lazy, you people are never going to amount to much. He couldn't ignore them forever. The next day, when Caleb walked into Miss Blake's classroom, he felt a mixture of fear and anger bubbling inside him. He kept his head down, avoiding her gaze, but as he sat at his desk, a thought crossed his mind that sent a chill down his spine. What if this wasn't just about him? What if there were other kids in the class, kids like him, who had been treated the same way? He had never seen Miss Blake treat any of the other students like this. Was it because he was black? Was it because his family didn't fit the mold of what she thought they should be? Caleb's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. But no matter how hard he tried, one thing was clear: he couldn't carry this weight alone. And soon enough, the truth would come out, setting off a chain of events that would change everything. The unraveling. The morning sun shone through the window, but for Caleb, it might as well have been dark. He sat at the breakfast table, staring blankly at his bowl of cereal. The milk had long since gone warm, and the once crisp flakes had turned into mush, but Caleb didn't care. His thoughts were consumed by the hateful words that had haunted him all night. Lazy, you people are never going to amount to much. Caleb had tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling of anger, confusion, and shame. He had tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that Miss Blake's opinion meant nothing, but the hurt ran deep. No matter how much he wanted to forget, the words lingered like a heavy cloud. Across the table, Malcolm and Lorraine exchanged worried glances. Caleb's silence wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. Normally, he'd be chatting about his plans for the day or asking questions about the world around him, his curiosity boundless. But now, his face was a mask of sadness, his eyes avoiding theirs. Caleb, sweetheart, you've hardly touched your breakfast, Lorraine said gently, trying to coax him back to the present. I'm not really hungry, Caleb muttered, pushing the bowl away. Malcolm set down his coffee cup, his gaze steady on his son. He had been patient, giving Caleb space, but now he knew it was time to dig deeper. Caleb, he began, his voice calm but firm. Something's been bothering you since yesterday. And your mother and I are here to help, but we can't do that if you don't tell us what's going on. Caleb's stomach twisted. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the secret he had been carrying since he saw the hateful words on his homework. He didn't want to burden his parents, especially his father, who fought battles like this every day in court. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't keep it in any longer. With a deep breath, Caleb reached for his backpack. His hands trembled as he unzipped it and pulled out the crumpled homework assignment. He stared at the paper for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, he placed it on the table, sliding it toward his parents without a word. Malcolm and Lorraine exchanged puzzled looks before glancing down at the paper. At first, everything seemed normal, just a simple math worksheet. But then Malcolm's eyes narrowed as he spotted the red ink at the top. The word lazy was written in bold letters, circled for emphasis. His jaw tightened as he read the remark at the bottom. You people are never going to amount to much. Lorraine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she read the cruel words. Oh my God, Caleb, she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Malcolm's face darkened with anger. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his pulse quickening as the gravity of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a bad grade or a scolding from a teacher. This was an attack on his son, an attack rooted in prejudice. Caleb watched his father closely, anxiety gnawing at him. He had never seen his father this angry before, not even when he was dealing with some of the toughest cases in court. There was a quiet intensity in Malcolm's eyes, the kind that Caleb had only heard about in stories. Stories of his father standing up to injustice, fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. But now, that fire was directed at the person who had hurt his son. Who wrote this? Malcolm asked, his voice low but steady. There was no need for him to raise his voice. His calm fury was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. Caleb swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Blake." The room fell silent. Lorraine looked at her husband, her eyes wide with shock. "His teacher?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "She wrote this." Caleb nodded, his eyes downcast. He felt a mixture of relief and fear now that the truth was out. Relief because the secret was no longer his to bear alone. But fear because he knew what was coming next. His father wasn't the kind of man to let something like this go. Malcolm sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career fighting against systemic racism, working tirelessly to hold institutions accountable for their actions. But this was personal. This wasn't just another case to be handled in a courtroom. This was his son, his 8-year-old boy, who had been subjected to the very kind of hatred he had dedicated his life to eradicating. "Caleb," Malcolm began, his voice softening as he turned his attention back to his son. "Why didn't you tell us about this sooner?" I didn't want to cause any trouble," Caleb admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "I thought maybe it wasn't a big deal. Maybe I could just ignore it." "Oh, baby, this is a big deal," Lorraine said, reaching out to stroke his hand. "No one should ever speak to you like this, especially not a teacher." Caleb wiped at his eyes, sniffling. "I just didn't want you to be mad." "I'm not mad at you," Malcolm said firmly. "I'm mad at her. And I'm going to make sure she answers for this." Lorraine glanced at her husband, concern etched on her face. "What are you going to do?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "First, I'm going to the school. This can't be swept under the rug. If she thinks she can get away with treating Caleb like this, she's got another thing coming." Later that morning, Malcolm stood outside Oakwood Elementary, his expression set in stone. He had changed into one of his sharpest suits, the same kind he wore when stepping into the courtroom to face his toughest opponents. He knew that walking into that school as an angered father wouldn't accomplish what he needed to do. He needed to be composed, strategic, but the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior was undeniable. As he walked through the front doors, the secretary greeted him with a smile. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "I'm here to speak with the principal," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "It's urgent." The secretary's smile faltered slightly. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Malcolm replied. "But I suggest you let her know that Malcolm Johnson is here, and it's in her best interest to see me immediately." The tone of his voice left no room for argument. The secretary quickly picked up the phone and dialed the principal's office. "Ms. Richards, Mr. Malcolm Johnson is here to see you." "Yes, right away." She hung up and gestured toward the hallway. "She'll see you now. Her office is just down the hall." Malcolm thanked her and made his way to the principal's office, each step deliberate and measured. Inside, Principal Richards was sitting behind her desk, a pleasant but slightly nervous smile on her face. She had heard of Malcolm Johnson, of course. His reputation as a fierce advocate for civil rights had preceded him, and she knew this meeting wasn't going to be an easy one. "Mr. Johnson," she said, rising to shake his hand, "please, have a seat. How can I help you today?" Malcolm sat down, placing Caleb's homework on the desk in front of him. "I'll get straight to the point," he began. "This was written by my son's teacher, Miss Blake. I want to know what you're going to do about it." Principal Richards glanced at the paper, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock as she read the comments. I'm so sorry," she stammered, clearly caught off guard. "I had no idea." "No, you didn't," Malcolm said, his voice firm but controlled. "And that's part of the problem. This isn't just about my son. It's about a teacher who thinks she can get away with making racist remarks to an 8-year-old child. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen." Principal Richards looked flustered. "Of course, we'll need to conduct an investigation." "An investigation?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a court case. The evidence is right there, in red ink." Miss Blake's behavior is unacceptable, and I expect immediate action. My son shouldn't have to walk into a classroom where his teacher sees him as lazy because of the color of his skin." "I understand," Principal Richards said, nodding quickly. "I'll speak with Miss Blake, and we'll take appropriate steps." Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You'll do more than speak with her. You'll ensure that she faces consequences. And if this kind of behavior has been directed at any other students, I expect you to take it just as seriously. I'm prepared to take this higher if I have to." Principal Richards swallowed hard, clearly unsettled by the intensity of the situation. "I assure you, Mr. Johnson, we'll handle this. I'll personally look into the matter and make sure that justice is done." Malcolm stood up, his expression unreadable. "I'll be following up to make sure of that." As he left the office, Malcolm felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. This was just the beginning of the battle, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But for his son's sake, and for every other child who might face the same kind of hatred, he was ready to fight. Unseen battles. Malcolm Johnson sat in his car outside Oakwood Elementary for a long time after his meeting with Principal Richards, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The world outside was bathed in mid-morning sunlight, but inside the car, Malcolm's thoughts were anything but bright. He replayed the encounter with the principal in his head, the polite but evasive tone she'd taken as soon as she realized the seriousness of the situation. He had seen it many times before, the instinct to downplay, to smooth over, to make this into a bureaucratic inconvenience rather than what it truly was, a moment of profound injustice. He couldn't let that happen. Not for Caleb. Not for any child. With a deep breath, Malcolm reached for his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in a while, one reserved for situations like this. Situations where he needed to make sure his voice would be heard. After a few rings, the familiar sound of his colleague's voice greeted him. "Malcolm, it's been a minute," said the voice on the other end. "What's going on?" "Marcus, I need a favor," Malcolm replied, his voice calm but filled with the weight of what was to come. "I'm dealing with a situation at Caleb's school. A teacher crossed a line, wrote something racist on his homework." There was a pause on the line before Marcus spoke again. "What do you need from me?" "I want the media involved," Malcolm said, his tone unwavering. "I need this to go public. I've already spoken with the principal, and I can tell she's going to try to handle it quietly. But this needs to be bigger than that. I need people to see what's happening, to know that this isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'll make some calls. I'll have a reporter reach out to you by the end of the day." "Thanks," Malcolm said, feeling the tension in his chest begin to ease. "I appreciate it." After ending the call, Malcolm sat back in his seat, staring out at the school. He could picture Caleb inside, sitting in his classroom, surrounded by the same walls that had once been a place of learning and safety for him, but were now tainted by the actions of a teacher who saw him through a lens of prejudice. It was a painful reality to confront, that even in a place where children should feel safe, there were people who would tear them down based on nothing more than the color of their skin. He knew that Caleb was struggling to make sense of what had happened. His son had always been resilient, always full of questions and curiosity about the world. But how could he explain to an 8-year-old that the world wasn't always fair? That people, sometimes even the ones you were supposed to trust, could harbor hatred in their hearts. Malcolm had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this, fighting against injustice with every fiber of his being. But when it hit so close to home, it felt different. More personal, more raw. Meanwhile, back at Oakwood Elementary, Caleb sat at his desk, his hands folded tightly in his lap as Miss Blake droned on about the day's lesson. She hadn't said anything about the incident, hadn't mentioned the words she had scrawled across his homework, or the hurt they had caused. To her, it seemed like business as usual. But for Caleb, nothing felt usual. He couldn't concentrate on the lesson, couldn't focus on the numbers on the chalkboard or the pages in his workbook. His mind kept drifting back to the red ink, to the way the letters had looked so harsh and final, like a sentence handed down without a trial. The other kids in the class were oblivious, chatting among themselves during the breaks, laughing and joking as if everything was normal. But to Caleb, everything felt off. The classroom, once a place where he felt confident and engaged, now felt suffocating. He couldn't help but wonder if any of the other students had ever been treated like this, or if he was the only one who had been singled out. When recess came, Caleb made his way to the playground, his steps slow and deliberate. He watched as his classmates ran to the jungle gym, shouting and playing tag. Normally, he would have joined them, eager to run and play, but today he felt disconnected from it all. He wandered over to the swings, hoping the gentle motion might calm his racing mind. As he sat down and started to swing, he felt a presence beside him. "Hey, Caleb," the voice said quietly. Caleb looked over to see his classmate, Jamal, sitting on the swing next to him. Jamal was one of the only other black students in the class, and while they weren't best friends, they had always gotten along. "Hey," Caleb replied, his voice subdued. Jamal kicked at the ground, setting his swing into a slow, lazy motion. "You okay, man? You've been real quiet today." Caleb hesitated. He hadn't told anyone else about what had happened, not even his closest friends. But something about Jamal's question made him want to talk, to share the weight he had been carrying. It's Miss Blake," Caleb finally said, his voice low. "She wrote something really mean on my homework." Jamal's eyes widened. What did she say?" Caleb swallowed hard, the memory of the words still fresh in his mind. "She called me lazy. And then she wrote that people like us, that we're never going to amount to much." For a moment, Jamal was silent, his swing coming to a stop as he processed what Caleb had just said. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with disbelief and anger. "She said that? For real?" Caleb nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yeah." Jamal shook his head, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "That's messed up, man. She can't say stuff like that." "I know," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper, "but she did." For a while, the two boys sat in silence, the sounds of the playground fading into the background as they processed the weight of what had happened. Jamal looked like he wanted to say something else. But before he could, the bell rang, signaling the end of recess. They both stood up, neither of them saying another word as they made their way back to class. The day dragged on, and by the time the final bell rang, Caleb felt drained. He was relieved when the last period ended, but the thought of returning to school the next day filled him with dread. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew that his father wouldn't let this slide. As he walked home, his mind wandered to what Miss Blake had said to him. It wasn't just the insult itself that hurt. It was the way it had made him question himself. Was he lazy? Was he not good enough? Was there something wrong with him because of who he was? He tried to shake the thoughts from his mind, but they lingered, gnawing at his confidence. When he reached home, Caleb found his parents waiting for him in the living room. His father stood by the window, staring out with a distant look in his eyes, while his mother sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. "Hey, buddy," Malcolm said, turning to face him. "How was school?" Caleb shrugged, dropping his backpack by the door. "It was okay, I guess." "Did anything happen?" Lorraine asked, her voice filled with concern. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No, not really. Miss Blake didn't say anything." Malcolm exchanged a look with Lorraine, then nodded slowly. "Good. Listen, Caleb, we need to talk to you about what's going to happen next." Caleb's heart skipped a beat. He had known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. "I spoke to the principal today," Malcolm began, his voice calm but serious. "And I'd also reached out to some contacts in the media. We're not going to let this slide, Caleb. What Miss Blake did was wrong, and people need to know about it." Caleb bit his lip, unsure of how to feel. On one hand, he was glad his father was standing up for him. But on the other hand, the idea of the media getting involved made him nervous. "What do you mean? Is it going to be on the news?" Malcolm nodded. "There's a reporter who's interested in your story. They'll probably want to talk to us about what happened." The thought of his story being shared with the world made Caleb's stomach churn. "But what if people don't believe me? What if they think I'm just making a big deal out of nothing?" "People will believe you," Lorraine said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "And even if some don't, that doesn't mean we stop fighting for what's right. This isn't just about you, Caleb. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Caleb nodded slowly, the weight of his parents' words sinking in. He didn't fully understand the complexities of racism and injustice, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to stay silent anymore. He didn't want to carry the burden of Miss Blake's words alone. "I'm scared," Caleb admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Malcolm said, kneeling down to meet his son's eyes. "But you're not alone in this, Caleb. We're going to fight this together." And in that moment, Caleb felt a sense of strength he hadn't felt before, a strength that came not just from within, but from knowing his family had his back. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, and the fight for Caleb's dignity had only just begun. The next steps would be challenging, and the spotlight would soon shine brightly on Oakwood Elementary. But Malcolm and Lorraine knew that this battle was worth fighting, not just for Caleb, but for every child who deserved to grow up in a world free of hate. The ripple effect. As the evening sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets, Malcolm sat at the dining room table with a pen and notepad, scribbling down thoughts for the interview. His mind was whirring with possibilities, trying to anticipate every question, every possible twist the media might take. The battle had officially begun, and he was determined to win. In the background, the faint sound of the TV played, but neither he nor Lorraine was paying much attention to it. Lorraine was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, though her movements were slower than usual, her mind clearly elsewhere. "Are you sure we're ready for this?" Lorraine asked, her voice cutting through the silence. She wasn't second-guessing their decision, but Malcolm could sense the worry behind her words. "Once it's out there, it'll be public. Caleb's story. Our lives. Everything changes." Malcolm put the pen down, rubbing his temples before standing up to join her in the kitchen. He placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her body. "I know, honey, but we can't let what happened stay in the dark. If we don't speak out, Miss Blake gets away with it, and she'll think it's okay to treat other kids the same way." Lorraine nodded slowly, but her eyes betrayed her concern. "I just don't want Caleb to be hurt by this, Malcolm. You know how the world can be. There are people who will twist this into something ugly. I don't want him to become the target of more hate." Malcolm's face softened. He understood her fear all too well. In his work, he had seen firsthand how stories like Caleb's could ignite public outrage, but also how they could spark backlash. But staying silent wasn't an option. "We'll protect him," he said firmly. "We'll do everything we can to make sure he knows he's not alone in this, and no matter what happens, we'll stand by him." Lorraine let out a small sigh, nodding. "Okay, I trust you." The next morning came with an air of anticipation. Caleb, unaware of the plans his parents had set in motion, went through his routine as usual, though the weight of the previous days still clung to him. His usually vibrant energy had dulled, replaced by a quiet uncertainty. As he finished his breakfast, Malcolm joined him at the table. "Hey, buddy, I need to talk to you about something important." Caleb looked up from his cereal, his brows furrowing. "What is it, Dad?" "We've been talking to some people, and there's a reporter who wants to interview us about what happened with Miss Blake," Malcolm said, watching Caleb carefully for his reaction. Caleb's spoon hovered over his bowl, and his face scrunched in confusion. "A reporter? Like, on TV?" "Not exactly. It might be in the newspaper or on the internet first. But people are going to hear your story," Malcolm explained. We're doing this to make sure no other kids have to go through what you did." The boy sat back, clearly processing what this meant. "But what if people get mad at me? What if they say I'm making it up?" Malcolm's heart clenched. This was the part he had feared the most, the idea that Caleb might doubt himself because of what others might say. "They won't," Malcolm said firmly, though he knew there were no guarantees. "And even if some people don't understand, you have us. You have your mom and me, and we're going to make sure your voice is heard." Caleb didn't say anything for a while. He stared at his cereal, stirring it absent-mindedly. "Okay," he finally said, though his voice was small, uncertain. Malcolm reached out and squeezed his son's hand. "You're brave, Caleb. Remember that. You're standing up for what's right, and that's something no one can take away from you." By midday, the wheels had been set in motion. Malcolm's contact, Marcus, had followed through on his promise, and a local journalist was already on her way to the Johnson home. As the family waited, Malcolm prepared Caleb for what might come next. The journalist, a young woman named Maria Ellis, arrived promptly, her face calm but serious. She greeted Malcolm and Lorraine with the professional politeness that comes with years of navigating sensitive stories. But the moment she saw Caleb, her expression softened. "Hi, Caleb," she said gently, kneeling to his level. "I'm Maria. I know this is probably a little scary, but I'm here to help tell your story. I want people to know what happened so they can understand why it's important." Caleb nodded slowly. "Okay." They settled in the living room for the interview, Maria sitting across from the family with her notepad and recorder. The conversation began with simple questions designed to put Caleb at ease. How old he was, what he liked about school, his favorite subjects. Slowly, Maria guided the conversation toward Miss Blake. "Can you tell me about what happened with your homework?" Maria asked softly. Caleb hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Miss Blake, she wrote something on my math homework. She said I was lazy, and that people like me wouldn't amount to much." Maria's face remained calm, but Malcolm could see the flash of outrage behind her eyes. "How did that make you feel?" Caleb's lip quivered. "It made me feel like I wasn't good enough. Like maybe she was right." Lorraine inhaled sharply, fighting back tears. She reached over and took Caleb's hand, squeezing it for reassurance. "She was wrong," she whispered. "She was so wrong." "Thank you for sharing that, Caleb," Maria said, her voice steady. "I know that wasn't easy, but what you're doing is really brave." The interview continued, with Malcolm and Lorraine filling in the details, how they had discovered the comment, their meeting with the principal, and the steps they were taking to make sure something was done about it. Maria listened intently, her pen flying across the page as she took notes. When it was all over, Maria stood and thanked the family for their time. "I'll make sure this story is told fairly," she promised, "and I'll keep you updated on when it will be published." As she left, Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anxiety, and a simmering anger that hadn't yet been fully released. He knew they had just taken the first step in what would likely be a long battle, but it was a step in the right direction. The story broke the following day. Maria had written an article that was both compassionate and pointed, highlighting not just what had happened to Caleb, but the broader implications of allowing such behavior to go unchecked. Within hours of the article going live, the online community erupted. Social media platforms were flooded with comments, some supportive, others skeptical, as Lorraine had feared. But the majority of the responses were in Caleb's favor. Parents from across the city, and even beyond, shared similar stories of subtle racism and prejudice in schools, stories that had never seen the light of day until now. People were talking, and as Malcolm had hoped, they weren't just talking about Caleb. They were talking about systemic issues, about how teachers like Miss Blake had no place in the education system, and about how schools needed to do better in protecting their students. But as the conversation grew louder, so did the backlash. A small but vocal group of people began to attack Caleb's family online, accusing them of blowing things out of proportion or playing the race card. They claimed that Miss Blake's comment had been misinterpreted, that it was just a harmless critique, and that the family was overreacting. Malcolm had prepared for this. He knew that standing up to injustice often meant standing in the path of resistance, but it still stung to see those words, to know that people could be so quick to dismiss his son's pain. The school, however, could no longer ignore the growing pressure. Parents were calling the administration, demanding to know what would be done about Miss Blake. The PTA held an emergency meeting, with several parents voicing their concerns about the environment their children were being subjected to. Principal Richards, no longer able to brush the situation under the rug, issued a statement acknowledging the incident and promising a full investigation. But Malcolm knew that wasn't enough. Words were easy. Action was what mattered now. As the days passed, the Johnson family found themselves at the center of a storm they hadn't quite anticipated. Caleb's story had sparked something much larger than any of them had imagined, a movement toward accountability and change in their school district. But while the public battles raged on, the real test would come next, facing Miss Blake herself, confronting the past, shaping the future. The day of the school board hearing had arrived, and the atmosphere at Oakwood Elementary was charged with tension. Outside the building, a crowd had gathered. Parents, students, and community members, many holding signs that read things like "Justice for Caleb" and "End Racism in Our Schools." News cameras were scattered around the perimeter, capturing every moment as people milled about, their faces filled with anticipation. Inside, Caleb sat quietly next to Malcolm and Lorraine in a waiting area just outside the boardroom. His small hands fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, and though he was trying to be brave, his anxiety was clear. Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You okay, buddy?" he asked softly. Caleb nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "I'm nervous," he admitted. "What if they don't believe us? What if they let Miss Blake go back to teaching?" Malcolm crouched down to his son's level, looking him in the eye. "Listen, Caleb, no matter what happens in that room today, you've already done something amazing. You've told the truth. You've been brave when it was hard to be. And that matters. Whether they do the right thing or not, we're going to keep fighting for what's right." Lorraine leaned over, giving Caleb the soft smile. "You're not alone in this. We're right here with you." As the doors to the boardroom opened, a stern-looking man in a suit stepped out and called for the Johnson family. "We're ready for you now." Malcolm stood, holding out his hand for Caleb. "Let's go show them what we're made of." The room they entered was sterile and formal, with rows of chairs facing a long table where the school board members sat. Principal Richards was there too, looking more uncomfortable than ever, his hands folded nervously in front of him. Miss Blake sat at the far end of the room, her expression cold and unreadable. The board chairperson, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, motioned for the family to take their seats at a small table positioned in front of the board. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Caleb, thank you for coming. We've reviewed the complaint, but we would like to hear directly from you." Malcolm took a deep breath, glancing at Lorraine and Caleb before beginning. "Thank you for having us," he started, his voice steady and firm. "We're here because what happened to our son, Caleb, is more than just a misunderstanding. It's a reflection of a much larger issue that can no longer be ignored." The room was silent as Malcolm spoke, his words clear and powerful. He recounted the incident, the racist remark Miss Blake had written on Caleb's homework, the pain it caused, and the lack of accountability that followed when Principal Richards dismissed their concerns. He didn't hold back, detailing how this wasn't just about one teacher's words, but about the responsibility the school had to protect its students from prejudice. Caleb sat quietly, his eyes downcast as he listened to his father advocate for him. Lorraine gently took his hand, offering him silent support. "Caleb is a child who deserves to feel safe and respected in his own classroom," Malcolm continued. And yet he was made to feel like he didn't belong, like he wasn't good enough. No child should ever have to feel that way, especially not from someone who is supposed to guide and uplift them. When Malcolm finished, there was a heavy pause. The board members exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of concern and discomfort. The chairperson cleared her throat before addressing Miss Blake. "Ms. Blake, would you like to respond to these accusations?" Miss Blake, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was low but defensive. "I didn't mean for my comment to be taken that way. It was a critique of his work ethic, not him personally. I have always treated my students equally." Malcolm felt his fists clench, but he stayed calm, knowing there was more at stake than his anger. The chairperson leaned forward, her expression stern. "Ms. Blake, the language you used was harmful and inappropriate, especially given the racial context. Whether you intended it or not, the impact on Caleb has been significant. As an educator, it is your responsibility to create an environment of respect and inclusion." Before Miss Blake could respond, Lorraine spoke up, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "My son came home that day questioning his worth. He wondered if maybe his teacher was right, if he would never amount to anything. Do you have any idea what that does to a child?" The silence that followed was deafening. As the hearing continued, it became clear that the board was taking the matter seriously. They questioned both sides thoroughly, trying to understand the full scope of what had happened. Principal Richards was grilled about his handling of the situation, his reluctance to take decisive action, drawing harsh criticism from the board members. When it was finally Caleb's turn to speak, he did so with a quiet courage that left the room breathless. "Miss Blake, she made me feel like I wasn't good enough," he said, his voice small but steady. "I try really hard in school, but after what she wrote, I didn't want to try anymore. I didn't think it mattered." His words hung in the air, raw and powerful. There wasn't a single person in the room whose heart wasn't touched by the vulnerability in Caleb's voice. Even the board members, who had maintained a formal tone throughout the hearing, softened visibly. "We hear you, Caleb," the chairperson said gently. "And we're going to make sure this doesn't happen to you, or any other student, again." It took nearly an hour for the board to reach a decision, during which time the Johnson family waited anxiously in the hallway. When the door finally opened, they were called back in to hear the verdict. The chairperson stood, her expression serious but resolute. "After reviewing the facts and considering the testimonies presented today, the board has determined that Ms. Blake's actions were indeed inappropriate and harmful. Effective immediately, Ms. Blake will be placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation. Additionally, we will be implementing mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff at Oakwood Elementary to ensure this type of behavior is not repeated." Malcolm and Lorraine exchanged a look of relief, but it wasn't over yet. "As for Caleb," the chairperson continued, "we would like to extend our sincerest apologies for the pain this incident has caused. We will be working with his teachers to ensure he receives the support he needs moving forward, and we will be monitoring the situation closely." It wasn't the full expulsion Malcolm had hoped for, but it was a start. It was accountability, and it was a step toward change. Caleb, though still processing everything, seemed to feel the weight lift from his shoulders. The adults had finally listened. He had spoken his truth, and it had mattered. As the Johnson family left the building, the crowd outside erupted into applause. The news cameras zoomed in on their faces, capturing the moment of victory. But for Malcolm, Lorraine, and Caleb, this was more than just a personal win. It was a message to everyone watching. A message that they would no longer stand for injustice, no matter how small or subtle. As they walked through the cheering crowd, Malcolm leaned down to Caleb and smiled. "You did it, buddy. You stood up for yourself. I'm so proud of you." Caleb smiled back, the first real smile Malcolm had seen in days. "I didn't do it alone," he said, looking at his parents with gratitude. "You never will," Lorraine added, pulling him into a tight embrace. The events at Oakwood Elementary sparked a ripple effect throughout the district. Other families came forward with similar stories, demanding action. The school board, eager to avoid further scandals, implemented sweeping reforms, including stricter policies on teacher conduct and mandatory training on racial bias. As for Miss Blake, she never returned to teaching. The weight of public scrutiny, combined with the investigation's findings, led to her resignation. She had underestimated the power of a single voice, a child's voice, and how that voice could ignite a movement. Caleb's story became a beacon of hope, not just for himself, but for countless others who had faced similar challenges. He had been a small boy in a big world that often felt unfair, but he had found his strength. And with the support of his family, he had learned that his voice mattered. In the end, the world didn't change overnight, but it did change, little by little. And Caleb knew, deep in his heart, that he had played a part in making it better, for himself and for all the kids who came after him.